So I'm actually an alumni from the 2011 Coase Institute, and this paper was developed during that workshop, so I'm very grateful for all the opportunities provided by the organization. Okay, so what I'm going to present to you today is a paper entitled Land Tenure, Price Shocks, and Insurgency, Evidence from Peru and Colombia. So the question that motivates this paper is, how do land arrangements affect armed conflict? Now, this is actually a very old and long-standing question in the literature, and it's so old that it was occupying the minds of prominent guerrilla leaders such as Mao and Che, who were very interested in knowing which type of peasant or peasants living under which arrangement would be more likely or more susceptible to the revolutionary appeals. Now, you can see that that's a matter of life or death to them. But also, it was a question of a lot of research done during the 60s and 70s that tried to address this concern. However, one of the shortcomings of this literature is that it was often unable to empirically disentangle the effect of land tenure or land arrangements on conflict, contrast to other factors that affect conflict. And you can think that poverty might affect conflict, but might also be associated with certain types of land tenure. So this literature did its best, but it mostly provided suggested evidence in that regard. Moreover, the second shortcoming of this literature was that it often did not provide a full treatment of the different incentives embedded in land tenure arrangements. So I'm going to talk about that later, but that is something I'm going to address in this paper. So what I'm going to do, so in this paper, I will try to address both of these concerns in the following way. I'm going to estimate the effect of income shocks and violence, and then see how the relationship between income shocks and violence varies conditional on the prevailing land tenure arrangement. Now, to do that, I proceed in two steps. So the first one is clearly to establish there is a relationship between income shocks and violence. And there's a lot of literature that supports this idea. And the logic behind it is that when you have an income shock, when households experience crisis or economic crisis or some sort of shock to their income, they have lower opportunity costs that would reflect in greater armed conflict or a greater likelihood of experiencing armed conflict or joining these organizations. Once I establish that relationship, I see how this varies according to the type of land tenure prevailing. And what we would expect is that in those places that are dominated by land tenure arrangements which provide little insurance against risk, understood as risk in terms of bad harvesting or volatility in the international markets, we should expect that those places exhibit that this relationship is weaker or non-existent to the extent that there's greater insurance. Now, I'm going to study this question in the context of two armed conflicts. One is that of Peru, and then I'm going to cross-validate the findings I derived from the Peruvian case for the Colombian case. So that would make sure that those conclusions I derive are not driven by simple Peruvian features, but actually can be extended to other contexts. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the Peruvian conflict. So this involved a Maoist guerrilla, and as every Maoist guerrilla, its goal was to surround the cities, that is, to build a base in the countryside, and from there advance and surround the cities all over the countries. Now, part of the success of this guerrilla was that it was able to capitalize on economic discontent of the existing peasants. Now, and it was actually a very long-lasting guerrilla. It lasted from 1980 to 2000, and it was credited with, or this conflict in general caused around 70,000 casualties, which makes it one of the most important or most salient episodes of political violence in Latin America. Now, what is the distribution of violence within this conflict? So one of the main patterns we can see is that there's a larger presence of violence, of armed conflict casualties or attacks in areas or districts that had greater coffee production than in those that didn't. Now, why would this be relevant? Well, this is because coffee is the main agricultural export in Peru and both in Colombia, of the agricultural exports is the main one, and therefore the one you would think is more susceptible to the volatility of the international markets and the one to which households would be more dependent on their income from. However, coffee is produced under different land arrangements, and we can see from this map that land arrangements are distributed mainly into individual property arrangements, communal property arrangements, and tenant arrangements. So, and by tenant, this mostly consisted of sharecropping arrangements. Now, individual property was very prevalent. It's the main, most important form of land arrangement, but communal land tenure was also present, has a strong presence in Peru, as well as sharecropping ones. So what I'm going to rely on is in these differences within districts of the prevalence of one land tenure arrangement versus others. Now, what does each land tenure arrangement mean? Now, these arrangements can vary in what I can call like two dimensions. The first one is the extent to which they insure the household or insure the peasants against variation in market risks or in volatility of coffee prices, as well as varying in the incentives they give to production. For example, in the case of small owners, their level of insurance is low because they absorb all the risk from changes in the international market, but they have a high incentive to produce because they reap all the benefits from their effort. In contrast, places that are dominated by sharecropping or communal land, the insurance is higher because the risk is spread out between themselves and the landowner, but the incentives to produce are a little bit lower relative to the owner because they only reap a share of what they are producing. So what you could expect from this different incentives embedded in contracts is that during income shocks, owners would be relatively worse off. That is, the effect of the income shock would be higher among owners compared to sharecropping, and that therefore this could lead to a differentially lower opportunity cost of violence and therefore more observed violence in those cases. Now, this is not to say that places that have ownership in general are more violent, but this is that under certain conditions of crisis, they actually experience a higher shock, and you would be likely to see them relatively worse off than others. So now I'm going to present to you some econometric evidence of this relationship. So the first one is, do we think or do we find that there's a relationship between income shocks and violence? Well, yes. So what I see in the Peruvian case and in the Colombian case is that lower coffee prices increase violence differentially in coffee-producing districts compared to those that were not producing ones. So just to give you a number, a decrease of 10% in the value of coffee production would lead to 0.03 more guerrilla attacks, and that guerrilla attacks, 0.03 more guerrilla attacks, and that this result is consistent across different types of violence measures, say number of army attacks, number of killings, or overall casualties. Now, the interesting question for this paper is whether this relationship between income shocks and violence varies according to the prevailing land tenure arrangement. And the answer is yes. So I do find evidence for that conditional relationship between of land tenure of this income shock and violence. For example, specifically, I find that this relationship changes in the presence of different measures of land arrangement. Specifically, a decrease of 10% in value of coffee production leads to more guerrilla attacks, but this is different depending on whether the district is dominated by ownership or dominated by sharecroppers or communal. Among owners, there's no difference. So you would see on average 0.7 more guerrilla attacks, which is actually quite sizable, as the other slide said. But among owners and communal, this would only be 0.01 attacks, which actually is a very small difference. That this suggests is that this land tenure arrangements tend to attenuate the effect of these income shocks on violence in these places. Now, this result I show in the paper is very robust, but the most important finding is that this is also visible in another separate context using different data, like that of Colombia. So this suggests that it might have applications way beyond that of Peru. Now, why is this the case? Well, if I'm really capturing an insurance effect, then what we should see is that the effect of negative income shocks should be visible on labor market outcomes. That is, that land tenure should mediate it, should affect violence through its effect on the labor market, and we can measure that based on measures of wages, hours, or employment. For example, during crisis, sharecroppers should exhibit relatively better labor market outcomes than owners, because as I said, their shock is relatively smaller than that of individual owners. Now, what do I find? Well, I find that using two separate tests for Peru and Colombia, I find that in the case of Peru, I exploit the monthly coffee production cycle. So if you think of coffee, it has some particular month in which is its harvest. So that means that the demand for labor in those months is increasingly higher. So what I use is to see whether the effect varies by month in sharecroppings versus owners. And indeed, what I find is that first, that drop in coffee production leads to more guerrilla attacks, but that is significantly smaller for sharecroppings, particularly during harvesting months. So this is consistent with the idea that the negative shock have a lesser impact on the labor outcomes of sharecropping districts compared to ownership ones. When I repeat this exercise for the case of Colombia, I also see the same pattern for the working hours and wages. So a negative income shock reduces wages and hours worked, but this is relatively higher or relatively bigger for areas dominated by ownership than for sharecropping. Now, to conclude, just very quickly, I think there are 3 points to be made. The first one is that negative price shocks consistently explain an increase in violence, and there's consensus in the literature about that. But what I want to highlight is that this effect is mediated by the type of property arrangement prevailing in that district. In particular, this shared arrangement seems to attenuate the negative impact, and it seems to do so by its effects it had on local labor market outcomes. Now, what would this mean in the aggregate? Well, first, it will highlight the importance of land institutions. So these income shocks do not happen in a vacuum. Actually, they're mediated by very clearly institutions such as land contracts. And second, it also highlights a not very obvious aspect of shared contracts, which is that these sharecropping and communal arrangements are often thought as inefficient, and they are because they provide less incentive for production. But sometimes, under certain circumstances, they might attenuate the impact of this negative income shocks better than in places where ownership is prevailing. Thank you very much.